What's up guys, as a chess coach I analyze a lot of games with my students, and today I'd love to share with you 5 common errors with the pawn play that lots of chess players commit and how you can easily turn that around. And the first rule is, an invitation is not an obligation. And just as it gives you some freedom in how you respond to unwanted invitations in real life, it helps you play chess better. For example, in this starting position of the French defense, Black has just played pawn to d5, offering an exchange of pawns, and a lot of players would actually take there, which is wrong. Now, real OGs know that to take is a mistake, and the idea being here that you only need to make an exchange when it gives you a certain advantage. But in this case, it is actually the opposite. You help your opponent solve his problem. Now, the French defense is usually used to illustrate a concept of a bad bishop. A bishop that is restricted by his own pawn chain and therefore cannot be active, does not have any squares to go to. However, in this case, if you trade off pawns, you actually help Black to eliminate this barrier on the way of his bishop, thus making it much more active, and you basically solve his biggest problems yourself voluntarily, and now Black is having a perfectly fine situation. Now, compare this with you pushing the pawn forward or maintaining the tension by going knight to c3. Now the bishop is locked and Black has to come up with some pretty complex strategies to make use of that piece. The beauty of all these rules is that they work in a large variety of different openings and different chess positions. For example, right now we can see something which looks to be like a totally different opening, but fundamentally the situation is the same. Should Black attack here on d4? The answer is no, and the reason is still the same. Currently, this bishop on c1 is blocked, kind of like it was in the French defense, but forcing this trade on d4, which was unnecessary for Black, opens up this diagonal, and White will develop his bishop actively and have no problems. Another classical example of this, of course, is the Caro-Kann defense, where lots of players would take here on d5. This is the second most popular move in the position, and that allows Black to solve the main problem of the Caro-Kann defense, this passive knight on b8. Now, in this opening, this knight is usually that bad piece because it's not easy for Black to find a way to develop it actively. If, let's say, we maintain the tension. Now, just look at these pieces. How can Black possibly develop them? Like, Black really needs to think about that because the bishop cannot really be developed. All these squares are taken away, and those backward squares are just passive. Similarly, Black can't develop the knight to the desirable square c6 because it's obstructed by his own pawn, and if he goes to d7, that will block the queen, the bishop, that will hand his pawn on d5, and that is clearly bad. Again, in contrast to this, if White trades on d5, White helps Black to get rid of his main problem, this pawn on c6, and after that Black will be able to develop this knight perfectly well, to develop the bishop, and again Black's got a very comfortable game. People kinda know this idea about minor pieces, but the same applies for heavy pieces, for queens and rooks just as well. For example, let's go into the King's Indian defense, and after Black advances his central pawn, White is faced with the same question. Should you take here on e5 or not? And the answer is still the same. An invitation is not an obligation, and to take is a mistake. If you take there on e5, like, look at this. This queen on d8 currently is passive, and there is no easy way for Black to somehow involve the queen in the game, make it an active piece that would attack something, that would cause a difference. Also, Black has some problems with development of his queenside knight, although it can be developed here to c6, but as soon as Black does that, White can always push this pawn forward and chase it away. Therefore, it is also a little bit of a problem of Black. However, if White trades on e5, now this queen is getting active. Black has no issues with bringing the queen into play anymore. Similarly, Black has no problems with developing his knight to this comfortable square. White cannot push d5 anymore, and therefore the knight on c6 will stand perfectly well. And again, White just helped Black solve all of his problems. The second tip is kind of an extension of the previous one, but nevertheless, it actually clarifies some of the situations. Let me create this artificial situation where when you're again facing this choice, whether to trade on c5 or not. And again, lots of players will always trade whenever there is an opportunity, and in most cases it is actually wrong. But here's another rule which you may keep in mind. You gotta analyze this trade-off and just figure out whether it's a good deal or a bad deal for you, right? And in order to decide that, you should avoid trading a stronger pawn. Now, a stronger pawn is a pawn that is more advanced than your opponent's pawn, and it is also a more centralized pawn. Now, if you look at this exchange, like what we're actually trading off here is this d4 pawn for this b6 pawn, because those two pawns are going to be eliminated as a result of this exchange. White's pawn from d4 disappeared, Black's pawn from b6 disappeared. Alright, now let's take it back. Therefore, if we compare these two pawns and try to decide which one is stronger, well, the pawn on d4 is more advanced, it is on the 4th rank, versus from the black perspective, the b6 pawn is on the 3rd rank, and also it is more centralized pawn, it is on one of the two central lines, while the b6 pawn is on the side. Therefore, the d4 pawn is stronger because it is more advanced and because it is more centralized, and the b6 pawn is clearly weaker, and therefore initiating this trade is just a bad deal for you and you should not do that. You may be wondering, Igor, but so what? After all, it's just an exchange of a pawn for a pawn, so what's such a big deal about that? Well, we are actually still helping our opponent. It's kind of like it was in the previous rule that we talked about. Think about this. If black wants to develop his knight in the current situation, let's say white plays something, and black wants to develop this knight, there is some issue here, right? Because if he wants to bring it here to c6, we'll always play d5 and kick it back to where it was. Therefore, it's not easy. Similarly, if black ever tries to develop his bishop to this diagonal, which seems to be like a really juicy diagonal for the bishop, you can always shut it down by going pawn to d5, then playing pawn to c4, on the next move knight to c3, and we completely barricaded this bishop on b7. It really has no moves forward. I mean, it could go to a6, but it does nothing there anyways, and therefore the bishop is completely out of the game. Versus, if we go back and imagine white forcing this trade on c5. Now black has no issues. He can comfortably put up his bishop to this long diagonal, and it's gonna put long-term pressure to your center and king side. Black will easily develop his knight to c6 to this comfortable square, and there is no pawn that can go forward and kick it back. Maybe somewhere in the long run, black will put his rook to this semi-open file and attack right there, and all that happened because you made that trade on c5, which white shouldn't do because it's a bad deal. Let me show you one more example of the same thing. I just want you to see clearly that these are real universal rules that apply to any openings, any positions, okay? So let's say black is expanding in the center and white is offering this trade. Should black accept it or not? Again, you need to figure out what are we actually trading off here. We're trading off this d4 pawn for white's b2 pawn, because there is another rule which says that you should take towards the center. Therefore, we want to move this pawn, which is currently on the side, towards the center, right? Therefore, these two pawns disappeared. And again, applying all the same logic, the pawn on d4 is more advanced pawn of black, and it is also on the central file. Therefore, he's trading his advanced and central pawn for this b2 pawn, which is doing nothing at all. Clearly, that is a bad deal for black, and he should avoid that. After this trade, now white is having some space advantage in the center. He can possibly push d4 himself in the future and just have this perfect center. He's got potentially this b file for the rook. His bishop is now having this additional diagonal to be developed to potentially. And again, all that happened because black engaged in a bad deal. The third tip is one of my favorite. It is called Be Untouchable, and it shows how you can defeat your opponents easily, because really there is a big fallacy about that. Lots of your opponents, in fact the vast majority of them, do not understand this completely. Now think about this position. It is black to play, and black noticed that we have opposite side castlings, and therefore he decided to launch his queenside attack, initiating the attack against the king. Now, perhaps white will try to do the same, and white will try to kickstart his attack on the king side. And the question is, who's going to be faster? Now, initially, it looks like black is kind of a little bit faster. He's playing b5. He's already threatening pawn b4. Now, after this knight will have to go away. This will drop the pawn. And this, in turn, forced white to play this defensive move, pawn to f3. Now, black goes pawn a5. And again, kind of looks like black is rolling out his attack pretty quickly, and white needs to be concerned. However, let's see what happened after that. White played pawn to h4, just trying to do the same on the king side. And after a4, h5, b4, again, for now, looks like the race is going on. We're not really sure who's going to be on top. White retreated his knight, and now black faced an interesting situation. He advanced the pawns, and looks like he had some sort of an accomplishment, and now he just needs to finalize his attack. But what can he actually do now? If he plays pawn to a3, white will easily keep the position closed by moving the b pawn forward, and black's attack got stuck. There's not much they can do now. If instead black tries to push the b pawn forward, again, initially it looks like black succeeded in, opening up the position on the queen side. And if white were to trade his a pawn, black would indeed have this great attack along the a file. However, white is not forced to do that, and there is a fairly well-known maneuver where white can trade on b3 first and then play pawn to a3, shutting the situation down completely, and again black is kind of stuck. There is no way for them to open up lines and to attack the king. And therefore, black's attack was kind of easily stopped without white really doing anything. Right? White just played one defensive move, pawn a3, and that is it. That is end of story. And now it's all unclear what else can black do to try to open up the situation further. However, if we look at the king side, the situation is actually much brighter for white. He's going to trade pawns on g6 and get to the king. For example, if black plays any move, whatever, like knight d7, we're going to trade these pawns, and then the h-file is open for our rook. We're going to trade the bishop, like queen h6 check, and checkmate black along the h-file. Queen h8, right? Very simple. Now, let's take it back. There's also another interesting tactics that is worth knowing. At first, it may seem like black can try to keep it closed by just grabbing this pawn on h5. However, it fails to these nice tactics. Rook takes, forcing the pawn to move, followed by queen to g5. And now, since the bishop is pinned, it can't move away, and black can't avoid the move queen takes g7 mate. Now, let's comprehend what has just happened and why it was so advantageous for white. Now, this is what it means to be untouchable. When the pawns of your castling are in their starting positions and you keep them intact, you don't move them, it makes it really hard for your opponent to do anything against that, to open up the position anyhow. And that was the difference which was so fatal for black here. They had a pawn on g6, and that allowed white to push the adjacent pawn, trade it off, open up the file, and finalized his attack, and black couldn't really do anything about that because black was not untouchable. He moved the g-pawn forward, and that triggered white's attack. This idea alone can help you to win numerous games, actually, and I'll now going to show you exactly how you can do that. If we just enter the most common chess opening position on amateur level, you can get to this something similar through different move order, it doesn't really matter. As soon as you go pawn d6 and you threaten to go bishop g4, lots of your opponents will wish to prevent this by going pawn h3 themselves. But now, they're not untouchable anymore. They don't know about it yet, but you know, and therefore you can take advantage of this. Black goes pawn h6, which initially looks like just a defensive move, like black is trying to do the same thing. However, black had something else in mind. After pawn d3, all of a sudden black played g5. They want to use that pawn to open up files on the queen side, therefore they want to push their adjacent pawn, open up the g-file, and checkmate white. Now, it looks like a premature attack, but in fact it's so quick and effective that it's not easy at all for white to stop it. In most cases, they play bishop e3, you go pawn g4, and now, thanks to this pawn on h3, white is forced to open up files. Think about this, if the pawn were on h2, there would be no issue for white at all. He'd just move the knight away, and it would be end of story for black. However, with the pawn on h3, now we attack the knight, we attack the pawn, plus our bishop x-rays the pawn as well, which forces white to do something about that. And after the trade, not only we made this pin happen anyways, we also opened up the g-file for the rook. After this, white traded on c5, which does not really change the situation. Then he played knight to d5, but now black can go knight d4 and capitalize on this pin. But the main issue for white is the fact that the g-file has been opened and now black can make use of it. He traded on f3 first, hitting the queen. White is forced to open up the king, but now rook g8 is coming into play, forcing the king to move, and now black only needs to bring the queen right there. Therefore, he trades on d5 and plays queen h4, checkmate. Now, it was very quick and effective, but it all started from white playing that little move. Think about this, pawn to h3, and this little move, which white probably haven't thought about at all, that would cause any troubles, in fact did just that. The fourth rule is break open the center to attack uncastled king. This position was taken from my game. I'm playing white against international master Dragomaretsky, who is playing black, and the position looks pretty messy. Black's got two bishops. On the other hand, he's a little bit behind in development, but he's trying to kickstart that attack on the queen side, so the situation looks unclear. However, there is one thing that we can keep in mind, that the king is centralized. However, straight away you cannot attack it because there is this pawn shield around it, which prevents white from going directly to the king and attacking it. Therefore, I played pawn f5, just offering black to initiate some of these trades, which would open up the e-file and certainly speed up my attack. In the game, black avoided that trade correctly. He played pawn b4, trying to seek counterplay. However, now white can follow up with a similar idea, knight to d5. This time, white is offering black to even capture the knight, because that would achieve the same purpose. That would open up the center and allow white to attack this uncastled king. And now black will have to cover up somehow like this, but that is pretty clear that white will have a massive attack here. Therefore, black avoided capturing the knight, instead played queen to b7. I continue with knight a5, just chasing the queen away. You can't go forward because of this fork to the king and queen, therefore the queen was pushed back to b8. But now white can finally make that trade and open up the situation around the king a little bit more. And now we can go rook to f1 and make use of this open file. In fact, black played bishop b5, trying to use this skewer, but then after queen to f2, white counters with the queen to f7 checkmate. And that whole attack became possible just because of that little pawn push f5 and a pawn exchange. Without the f-file being open, white would be at the dead end, not knowing how to continue the attack. But now he's just winning the game. After rook a7, I played knight f6 check, and after this trade, black just resigned. White is threatening to capture one of these pawns, attack the king, attack the rook, and black is defenseless. And here's another little idea that makes a big difference in the way you play chess. Now let's get into the Sicilian defense, and let's say black goes pawn e5. How do you play here as white? Now clearly, you need to move the knight somewhere, right? It's been attacked. And lots of players in this situation would just trade on c6, and that is wrong, because there is another rule which states that you should avoid exchanges that strengthen your opponent's center. And here, by taking on c6, what you help black to accomplish is to move this side pawn closer to the center and actually make it a more valuable pawn. Now, after pawn takes c6, now this pawn covers this square, therefore white can't ever, for example, put his knight there. Also, in the long run, maybe black will even play pawn d5 himself. Again, compare this to the situation where white moves this knight to b5. Now, this pawn on b7 is totally passive, not doing anything at all, and black now has to deal with these weaknesses. White can easily jump with his knight forward and take advantage of them. Now, going back to knight takes c6, lots of players use that just because that feels like an easy escape from the problem, because the knight's been attacked, and what can be easier than just to trade it off. And yes, indeed, you save your knight, however, you strengthen your opponent's center. Think about this. Let's say white goes bishop c4, black continues knight f6, attacking this pawn, white guards it, black goes something like bishop b4, pinning the knight, and for example, white covers that, and now black goes pawn d5, and this pawn made this central push possible. Now black is attacking these pawns and pieces, and after this trade, black actually promoted his pawn from b7 twice in a row. And this little modest pawn, which used to be there on b7, unnoticed by anyone, now is in the spotlight, living it up, like attacking everybody and just having a cool life. So how could that happen? Maybe it's because the American dream is still alive, but maybe it's also because white was naive enough to allow that to happen with his own trades, first on c6 and then on d5. And now indeed black's got a really great game. He's attacking the bishop b5 check is not a problem, that's just a single check. After that, black's got a strong center, it is ready to be pushed forward anytime black wants to, and black has a nice positional advantage. Here's another very common situation where you can make use of that rule easily. In such positions, it is nice to develop your bishop to e3, offering this exchange, and lots of your opponents will lightheartedly take on e3 indeed, which allows you to move your f2 pawn closer to the center of the board, and now this pawn starts taking part in our central game. For example, it covers that square d4, therefore black can't ever move his knight forward. Moreover, maybe in some variations, you can actually push your own pawn forward and try to occupy the center and get two pawns in the center, like the classical beautiful pawn center. Also, there is one more plan which is actually very effective here for white. It is to jump with the knight to h4, reroute the queen right there to g3, and use the f-file to launch the attack on the king side. So you can do that by going queen to e1, and then we aim to bring our queen right here, and after that we'll start this maneuver of the knight. Alright, if black goes bishop e6, we're not going to fall for that mistake. You can just drop the bishop back and allow black to trade, which doesn't change anything in the position besides opening one more line for one more rook of white. Therefore black is kind enough to help us activate our position. Let's say black plays something like pawn a5 or pawn a6, doesn't matter, and from there you can start playing knight h4, knight h5, queen g3, and black's in big trouble. Even if they try to cover that square, you can still play queen g3, and even if computer can theoretically defend this position, in real chess I got like really great results here with white, because you have a strong attack and it's unclear what can black do. You're already threatening rook takes f6 because the pawn is pinned. He can't go knight g6, you attack this square twice, therefore that would just lose a pawn for black. In general, if this knight is ever moved, you can always land your knight to f5, and after that you have all these threats of queen takes g7 mate or knight takes h6, making use of the pin, and black is quite in trouble. You can even double your rooks along the f file if required, and all in all I would say that it's just much easier to play this position with white, and it all started with black right here after bishop to e3, with black capturing on e3. And the fun fact about this is that black didn't have to do anything. The bishop on c5 was already guarded. He could just castle or do whatever, and his position was totally fine. There was no need for black to do anything. If white trades on c5, no problem. Now black still has this juicy square for his knight in the future. I hope that it inspires you to see that sometimes those little tips about pawn play can actually make a big difference. Having said that, of course, pawn play is just one piece of a puzzle. If you want me to help you to get your chess to the next level, I've put together a special bundle called Boost Your Elo to 2000. You can access it by clicking the link below the video in the description, where I've included everything that you need to get to that level. And you can just follow a proven roadmap, which has already been tested by thousands of other students, and achieve your chess goals faster. Either way, hope it was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.